A lot of what we do is relatively, recent in its history. There is no ancient evidence of people practicing sequences of contortions on mats in groups and then, leaving the class to go and get on with their busy urban lives. That's a very latest, perhaps 20th century thing. There isn't a lot of historical precedent. Of course, there's a history of doing things with the body, and there is obviously an intention through yoga practice to sort of equip one to be more capable in some way, to empower the practitioner, and therefore some people must have dabbled in it a bit. But for most of the history of yoga, it was something that was a full-time commitment.
Welcome to the Embodying Philosophy as a Way of Life podcast. I'm Floss, yoga teacher, scholar practitioner, and seeker of embodied wisdom. You were just hearing Daniel Simpson, author of best-selling book, The Truth of Yoga, talking a little bit about some of the tensions that arise in the modern yoga landscape as we seek ancient wisdom in modern times. This podcast explores philosophy not as abstract theory, but as the practice of meaningful inquiry in relation to our lives as they are lived today, through conversation, contemplation, and perspectives from different traditions, yoga, mystical Christianity, and beyond. I'm so delighted you're here. Enjoy episode 1. Hello and welcome to the Embodying Philosophy as a Way of Life podcast. Today, I am very lucky and privileged to be joined by Daniel Simpson. Daniel Simpson has a master's degree in traditions of yoga and meditation from SOAS. He also taught on that course, I believe, and is the author of The Truth of Yoga, a public-facing book on the history and philosophy of yoga. As well as being a scholar practitioner and running courses on the history and philosophy of yoga for teachers and practitioners alike, he is also a devoted practitioner of asana, pranayama, and meditation, which he's studied on numerous visits to India since the 1990s. Daniel previously worked as a foreign correspondent, which helps him make complex subjects feel accessible, which I hope he will do for us today as well. Welcome, Daniel.
Well, thank you for inviting me, Floss. It's an honor.
The honor is truly mine. So today we're going to be talking about ancient texts and modern priorities. And as many of us yogis, yoga practitioners, yoga teachers are aware, when we think of yoga philosophy, we often think of the texts first.
Yes, although I wish we didn't, because the whole point of philosophy really is just to make sense of why we do what we do. And I think that should be integral to practicing and teaching yoga. But it's so rare to find a yoga studio that puts, talking about ideas on the timetable on a regular basis. In fact, the only place that people can easily access that sort of thing in person is through a yoga teacher training. And a lot of people train to be teachers to learn a bit more about history and philosophy as well as anatomy and what it is they're doing with their practice, and perhaps even why they're practicing, rather than to become teachers. And I wish there were more ways in which just the simple asking why could be part of just being a regular practitioner and to be supported by teachers in that way.
Very true. I mean, I think about my own initial decision to take a teacher training, and it was completely for that. It was because I wanted to go deeper into the philosophy and spirituality of yoga, not really to teach, although as for many of us, it ends up that you do teach. But it was to deepen that inquiry, which, I only kind of heard about in drips and through my own research. It wasn't a central part of the modern yoga syllabus in the studios I was part of.
No, and even when it is, it tends to be presented honestly in a slightly misleading way. First of all, glossing over the fact that a lot of what we do is relatively, recent in its history. There is no ancient evidence of people practicing sequences of contortions on mats in groups and then leaving the class to go and get on with their busy urban lives. That's a very latest, perhaps 20th century thing. There isn't a lot of historical precedent. Of course, there's a history of doing things with the body, and there is obviously an intention through yoga practice to sort of equip one to be more capable in some way, to empower the practitioner, and therefore some people must have dabbled in it a bit. But for most of the history of yoga, it was something that was a full-time commitment, and involved retreating from society and largely sitting still. And this is all very different. So when we do turn to the texts that most people want to look at, say the Yoga Sutra of Patanjali or the Bhagavad Gita, they've got absolutely nothing to do with postures, really. I mean, the only reference to posture is basically it should be steady and comfortable, and it becomes that way through basically letting go of caring whether or not it's comfortable, getting totally absorbed in meditation, no longer making an effort, and being indifferent to discomfort is basically what Patanjali says. And the Bhagavad Gita just says, sit up straight if you want to meditate, and then goes on for the other, 690 odd verses to talk about other things. There isn't actually a connection unless we start to think a lot more subtly about what we're doing and why we're doing it, which is why those questions need to be raised. But I think they make teachers feel uncomfortable, especially in the 21st century where we're all painfully aware of the influence of colonialism on the history of yoga, perhaps, or certainly on the fact that there are now lots of South Asians living in the UK, and they're here because we were there, and that yoga has come from east to west in that context, and that therefore, the sort of mixing and matching of yogic traditions with new ideas for us to make money in our own way, leaves us open to accusations of cultural appropriation and other such things. So people are, desperately keen to be authentic and are afraid that if they start talking about how it's all, not as old as we think, and we'll have to start thinking for ourselves about how to make connections, that they might fall into a very uncomfortable place indeed. So it's much easier to say, do the practice, read Patanjali, it's all the same thing. And that's just not true, unfortunately.
Yes, I feel with many people when they begin to get into yoga and find some kind of deeper meaning, deeper benefit in their embodied experience through the practice, they then seek an authentic yoga. And often an authentic yoga is associated with going back to ancient yoga without acknowledging that there is not only a huge temporal difference of possibly thousands of years, depending at which expression of yoga we're talking about, but also contextual difference. So is yoga philosophy then relevant to modern people? How do we bridge this space?
Well, people have been struggling with the problems of being people for a very long time, and yoga philosophy talks about that. It's essentially a quest to transcend the suffering that is inherent to existence in a way. That's certainly what Patanjali says in his Yoga Sutra. The discriminating person will see that, in fact, everything is suffering because of the way that we relate to it, because of our misunderstanding, because of the accumulation of, I guess, conditioning patterns from our previous experiences that lead us to get ever more entangled in confusion and to behave in ways that, rather than liberating us, get us not only more confused and more entangled, but less likely to understand what it means to disentangle ourselves. And the modern world is full of that. We're ever more absorbed in distractions, we're ever more agitated by things that trigger us, and we're ever more confused about what's true. And those are the three things that Patanjali says in the very first sutra. There's a commentarial line that explains those are the three types of mind state that are going to get in the way of recognizing that underneath all that, there is a clarity of perception which might enable us to see things as they actually are, including ourselves, and to no longer be so caught up in our attachment to this body or the ideas between our ears, and that in fact there might be a way of perceiving that would not be such a cause of embodied suffering, but might be actually a cause of embodied liberation, a sense of being unimpeded by the difficulties of being a human. There is no escaping the ultimate difficulty in the sense that this body will fall to pieces and stop working. But the idea with yoga philosophy is if you look at it, with true detachment, without all of this personal investment, that's just a fact of life. That's okay. There's no need to get too hung up about that. And so, in that sense, it's eternally relevant because we're all having to face the reality of death. We're all having to face the reality of things making us feel uncomfortable, unhappy, and us compounding it by the way we look at it. It's not possible to escape sickness, old age, and death, but it is possible to stop making it worse by the way that we respond to those realities. And yoga philosophy was always talking about that. But to sort of look at it the other way around, which is how you were presenting the question, I sometimes frame this by asking people who first went to a yoga class to avoid being reborn. And I don't usually get many people saying me, because that's the way in which these teachings came into being. And the idea was that if you see through this illusion of being an embodied person subject to suffering, there is no fear of death, and you attain some sort of immortal state, which basically means not being reborn. So you're transcending a cycle of births, which would otherwise continue indefinitely. The whole concept of philosophy that influences yoga practice is rooted in that worldview. And since most people don't have that worldview, I don't think the solution is to try and drum it into our heads and make us think that unless we've got that worldview, we're inauthentic yogis, but more to think about, well, what was actually the point of the solution to that problem, and is some of that solution still relevant to us? And alleviation of suffering still seems a very helpful thing, even if the sort of underlying philosophical rationalization for it might not be present in every case.
Yeah, that's really interesting. I guess what you're talking about is this greater metaphysical vision, this worldview that, I mean, the early ideas are potentially, 2000-ish years ago, let's say. And the worldview then is quite different. The context quite different. The goals are quite different. You talk about liberation, moksha. And I remember once I started talking about that in a class I was teaching, because I'd had this revelation about how to, maybe we can think about it differently because this isn't our goal. And the students didn't actually know that yoga is about liberation, because that's something that's not commonly known. Of course, yoga teachers know it, or they should really know it from their yoga teacher training. But then this is the other thing. You might go into a yoga teacher training and suddenly, depending on where you're taught and what context and their kind of approach, you might be taught this new system, this new worldview, this new metaphysics at somewhat face value, and kind of been told this is accurate. And it's that kind of conflict of worldviews. And it's not necessarily, I mean, studying the Vedic, the Indian, the yogic traditions shows us that multiple views can coexist, right? Multiple values, which we can talk about a little bit more in a sec, can coexist. Some people might be seeking liberation, but not everyone in society is going to be seeking that as their primary goal right now. In terms of yoga philosophy, that piece might be missing. And then suddenly we're being told that yoga philosophy is about liberation, which is essentially a kind of death as well. And many of us are very attached to our lives. And it leads to a kind of disconnection and disjunction and an ungroundedness, I would say.
100%. I mean, we just have to look at what it really means from the point of view of Patanjali to reappraise whether or not that text ought to be the yoga Bible, for want of a better way of putting it. Because having said that, everything is founded on this problem of suffering, and having started from the assumption that there is a cycle of births that needs to be escaped, Patanjali is, a fundamentalist. He's basically saying nothing but freedom from this cycle is worth having as the objective. And the solution actually amounts to letting go of the body. What one scholar has described as deathly otherness. That's the attainment of a liberated state as described by Patanjali, involving a complete disengagement from the material world. So when we're talking about liberation, I think we need to start asking ourselves a few more sort of specific questions about what we mean by freedom. Are we looking to be free from the world, or free in the world? Free from the body, or free in a body? Free to do things, or free from the affliction of what we've done already that's conditioned our mind, that makes us want to do more things? Because the early yogis were basically saying the problem is this never-ending cycle of cause and effect that is propelling me forwards into more activity. The solution is to stop doing anything, and to let go of attachment to the world, to let go of the idea of me, and basically don't really do anything ever again, have no more desires, and you've unwound the problem. But that's extreme, and the solution to, Patanjali talks about it, talking about the fruits of having a purified mind. The niyama of shaucha is said in the 40th sutra of the Sadhanapada, the second book of the Yoga Sutras. The fruit of that is disgust for the body and
Mhm.
no contact with others. And then the commentarial line that explains that goes into more detail and says, well, truly understanding that this disgusting flesh suit that oozes substances out of every orifice can never be properly cleaned, you understand that it's an imperfect thing, and that you would be best rid of it. And as an ascetic, you can devote yourself to the mindset that says, well, who cares about the body? And that's the sort of purity of mind that Patanjali is saying, a yogi on the path will develop. Because he's talking to renouncers. He's talking to people who have decided this problem is so severe that it basically amounts to being a person in the world. And the solution to it needs, therefore, to be really extreme, to renounce the world, to stop being a person, to sit still, shut up, not do anything. And so that's the kind of backdrop to the practices he's teaching, which isn't to say his text doesn't have relevance to us. In fact, there's a lot of very useful information in there, both about, the subtleties of meditative states, and about, some very practical pointers on what we can do to get a bit more grounded in a body, and to slowly understand that if we did actually want to get out of a body and away from the world, we better get very familiar with what it is to be in a body and in the world. And we could therefore change the ultimate framing to say, well, I'm not looking to get rid of being an embodied person in the world, but instead just looking to become a little less afflicted by my experience of being in the body in the world. And for Patanjali, that would be no use at all. He'd tell you that was a waste of time, probably. I mean, we don't know. We can't bring him back to get here. But he does say the choice is between, it's very simple, freedom, apavarga, or bhoga, the entanglement and enjoyment of the world. It's just a simple binary from his point of view, but all binaries exist on a spectrum. And so the question is, where on that spectrum are we? How far do we want to go with either absolute hedonism or total renunciation? And what can we do to make sure we're moving a little bit more skillfully in the right direction? And so that it requires us to get more familiar with how we're, let's say, conditioned or triggered, and what we can do to step aside from that, to make more space to be able to be with the discomfort of being a person. And so from that point of view, he's got some really insightful things to say about the challenges, and even about the potential benefits of engaging in yoga practice. We're just probably not going to go all the way.
Mhm. Yeah, I completely see that, especially more recently as I returned to the text for my own course. And I guess on the one hand, there's this high philosophy, these big ideas about liberation and reality, metaphysics, worldview. And then there's that more practical element, which can be really useful and insightful because essentially it's a theory of mind attachment, which we all have. And I do think a yoga practice can be so powerful to build awareness in the body, in your thoughts, in your breath, and in your nervous system, because then you can begin to find that spaciousness, as you say, and begin to notice. And having been in a more relaxed state, say the early stages of samadhi, even, you can then notice what you describe as that conditioning in other parts of your life. Notice when you start reacting or get triggered, and then find more freedom in those moments. Someone on my course recently described them as mini mokshas, and I liked that because
Yeah.
you talk about the highest goal, which is liberation, and for me that always has this idea of perfection and being this perfect enlightened person that I kind of imagine in my head as a spiritual person, especially when I first did my teacher training, which just made me suffer even more because I felt like a failure.
Mm. Yeah, it's a real challenge. I mean, the other extreme is to go, as a lot of people do, instinctively for the more here and now non-dual approach to it all, and say there's nothing we actually need to do at all because underneath we're all wonderful and we're embodiments of divinity, and all we need to do is accept that and recognize it and let it flow through us. In fact, the whole idea of not being good enough is an illusion. And, that sounds wonderful, but it often leads us away from practical engagement with the fact that there is a part of us that doesn't feel good enough. There is a separation within us. And there are separations in life between me and you, or this body and the surroundings it's in. There is an interaction between everything, but at the same time you can only have an interaction if it's sort of distinct things that are engaging with each other. If it's all one, then there aren't separate things to engage with each other, and that's a very comforting soup that people like to sort of dissolve themselves into, but it often removes the sort of tools for thinking about how to be more skillful in relationship, either to oneself or to others or the world, that I think a text like the Yoga Sutra does acknowledge, because it's built on a dualistic framework. There is an ultimate separation between the spiritual principle within and everything else, including the mind, the body, and the world. But there's at the same time distinction between the spiritual principle as found in this embodiment and others. And there is always this distinction going on. And I think that's quite helpful sometimes, although it can also be a source of misery if we hold ourselves to impossible standards. But then again, that's another opportunity for learning, I think. And a sort of 21st century yoga philosophy would perhaps start with that as one of the modern afflictions. Patanjali's got his five kleshas, and they still make sense. Basically, the problem of craving and aversion and confusion about who we are, expressed in multiple forms. And we need to perhaps add some others because of the degree of our identification with ourselves, and the extent of our competitiveness and tendency to compare ourselves either to others or to abstract standards. This is a very modern affliction, and obviously technology is making it worse. It started with the mirror, and the mobile phone has intensified it.
What kleshas would you add?
Well, I don't know.
We
That's a
are
great question. Yeah, I think instead I would almost sort of throw the question back to anybody who's listening and say, this is a question to bring to those as yet not so frequently existing yoga philosophy sessions that should be part of most yoga schools. Be like, what is the nature of the problem that we're all struggling with? And see if we can actually think it out for ourselves. Rather than what I say about me, what are you experiencing? And how is that impacting the potential for being more present, more content, more at ease. What form is that taking if we're really honest with ourselves? I think we could all end up with our own lists. Similarly, in the same way, we ought to think of new lists of ethical principles, because Patanjali's yamas and niyamas are very much conditioned towards the idea of being a world renouncer. Not to say there's anything wrong with not harming and telling the truth, but once we start to get to the celibacy bit, most modern practitioners have to reinvent that to make them feel happy with their lives. And so I start to think, well, maybe we should add some other things to the list. And again, that will depend on our personal, sense of what's important.
Hmm. Yeah, you said so many interesting things there. One, which is you're quite positive about dualism, which I find really interesting because at least when I first got into yoga, it was the idea of non-duality, which was like, whoa. And I had an experience of unity in my body through a Kundalini yoga class. And I was like, whoa, all the ideas I've studied in sociology and philosophy and my own mind about reality and duality. There's this desire for unity, and yoga seeks that. And then over time, I became disillusioned with that because it was like this ideal which was unattainable in a way. Because, as you rightly say, we live in a world of duality and plurality, which is not necessarily a negative thing. It allows for beauty, it allows for dialogue, it allows for everything we experience, which is amazing in the world, and possibility. And it's also through that we find, mini mokshas, revelations that we learn. So I thought that was really interesting. And also perhaps you know, even the Samkhya, the dualistic metaphysics of Patanjali's Yoga Sutra, it's still has, it still has space for that, I would say.
Well, that's an interesting question. And a lot of the time when I end up teaching these subjects, or particularly posting about them on social media, somebody wants to make the text conclude with a sort of collapsing of the duality into non-duality. Um, and that's not a new thing. That's really the history of what's happened to Patanjali's ideas, in the last few centuries, as the philosophy of Vedanta has kind of taken over from Sankhya as the one most commonly associated with yoga. But I do question whether Patanjali himself, again, would be happy with that if we were to somehow be able to transport him into the modern world and ask his opinion. He seems pretty clear about the idea of yoga, the connection between Purusha and Prakriti being the problem. And effectively that means, the misperception in the mind that it's free, and that it is the pure witness consciousness. And the only way to understand that that isn't the case is to learn to see the difference between the mind and just the pure presence behind it. But obviously, once we actually do that, even if it's only for an instant, which we've all done at some point in life, we've just been caught up in
Mhm.
the wowness of now. That's immediate and unignorable, but obviously doesn't last very long most of the time. If it's just being awed by something we perceive in the natural world, or having a really intense experience, or just fully engaged in what we're doing. It is, as you say, a sort of integrated experience. And so, there isn't in the end much distinction between the integrated experience one accesses through a sort of dualistic framework that clarifies perception to be, entirely present and absorbed, or a non-dual one that sort of removes all ideas of separation to bring it all together in this integrated experience of pure presence here and now. So in the end, it's just consciousness. Whether you isolate it from everything else or include everything within it is kind of academic in the end. It's like going in two opposite directions to reach a similar spot. But you can't go in both directions at once. That's the only thing. So I tend to think of them as sort of means to a state of being, which is what yoga was originally described as. I mean, even Patanjali is describing yoga as a state in which the mind is stilled. Um, It's not a practice in that sense. And we are so used to the idea of doing yoga today that we overlook that. And we're even more attached to the idea that doing yoga is one thing and meditation is another thing. But again, if we could bring back Patanjali, he would say, what are you talking about? Yoga is the state attained through meditative practice.
Yeah. And if we move to the Bhagavad Gita, yoga can be in any action, right?
Indeed. Yeah. Yeah. Yoga is a state that's attainable by multiple paths. And yeah, you rightly mentioned that action is quite important to the Gita. It's a rare exception to this general trend that most texts teaching how to get liberated are trying to say the world is the problem, leave it behind. The Gita is saying, if you just change your relationship to the world, then it's possible to be engaged. You just have to let go of all of your desires to get anything through your activity. And yeah, it's not much of a step from there into the tantric worldview of, yeah, it's all just an energetic pulsation anyway. None of it is to be sort of avoided or transcended. It's just to be understood. And the transformative potential of doing that will take you into a higher state. But there's also the risk of getting, yeah, ever more entangled in the process if you don't make a distinction between things. So, yeah, it's an
So
evolution.
if we follow that evolution from Patanjali's Yoga Sutra to the Bhagavad Gita to the Tantras and Tantric revelations, we do see yoga move from the more renunciate ideal, someone who renounces mainstream society, lives outside it, dedicates their life to meditation, tries to not do too much action, renounce from worldly action, to rid themselves of these cycles of karma and samsara and then achieve enlightenment. But over time, we see yoga become a possible goal for others in society. Is that right?
Yes, although not much is said about these household practitioners. There are very few texts that we have access to now that talk about that. There are occasional descriptions. I mean, the great stories of ancient India, the epics, the Mahabharata and the Ramayana, have all sorts of people doing a bit of yoga for useful purposes. Often, like in the Bhagavad Gita, Arjuna, he's a sort of royal warrior and is taught a bit, just enough yoga to make him more effective at fulfilling his duty on the battlefield. And there are many other ways in which people dabble in yoga temporarily to get some benefit, whether it's literal empowerment or the ability to navigate something difficult. So there's always that in the background. Then there are tales of those who do seem to sort of have a half-half approach to these things. There's a medieval Hatha Yoga text, the Shiva Samhita, and it ends with a description of a householder who lives with a wife and children, has lots of fun once he's seen through the illusion of everything and is truly liberated. There's no need, therefore, to be celibate, to be a renouncer, to abandon family life. You could have it all, so to speak, but only if you've been able to actually go beyond some of these afflicted states of being that keep us entangled in suffering. And it's much harder. It's much easier in some ways to go to the cave because then there is nothing else happening. But to be caught up in worldliness means there are many more ways in which one can be unskillful and more attached and entangled as a result. Not much is said about that throughout history until relatively recently, to be honest. I mean, it's the 20th century when we get the whole sort of systematization of approaches to yoga practice based on non-seated postures. Also, the purpose of that being for health and well-being, to be less stressed and more effective in day-to-day life. And for that to be available to anyone, really, without the need to have a guru, without the need to join a particular sect, without the need to even be in India. And early influential 20th century innovators in the Indian yoga teaching world consciously encouraging students to take what they've learned and share it, and being quite happy to see it go overseas and evolve into whatever is needed to help people. But at the same time, I don't think that should sort of give us the sense that we have license to do whatever we want with it. Those innovations were still, I think, aligned with this earlier principle of alleviating suffering, and also at the same time trying to use the techniques in a way that it was, we could say, a little bit watered down, but still along the same lines. And therefore, there was an idea of trying to shift perspective on some level, that it wasn't just about the body, that it was working with the body, perhaps to influence the mind, but also through some kind of control of the mind to perhaps see something beyond both the mind and the body. So that's still there, I think, in even 20th century postural yoga in India. And that's what doesn't get exported quite so readily, it seems. There is a sort of consistency in philosophical orientation to the evolution of different approaches to practice that do make it more householder friendly, more worldly, more in some ways export ready, making it more about physical techniques that are for health and well-being here and now. But there was still, I think, in most cases, an understanding that yoga was about more than the body. And that's what gets lost very easily once we enter the 20th century and 21st century, even more so with the advent of social media world of people making shapes and showing off the making of shapes and thinking that actually making shapes is yoga. And although it can be quite empowering to be in a body that is absorbed in making shapes, that's not what any of these earlier yoga texts were talking about. And so I think that evolution that makes things householder friendly, if we're not careful, can very quickly sort of evolve to the point that a lot of what was recognizably yogic gets stripped out of the mix, and it all just becomes about getting bendy and feeling good. And there's nothing wrong with being bendy or feeling good. But that's not definitely not what early yoga texts were talking about. They were talking about, I mean, I suppose you end up with people rationalizing it by saying, well, the difficulty one experiences in trying to get bendy rubs one up against, the uncomfortable attachment one has to, perhaps unachievable expectations or limitations in the body. And so there's a softening around all of that. And there's all sorts of ways in which people rationalize postural yoga practice, but none of those are found in old texts. They are modern inventions. So that's again another reason why I like to say, let's bring all that out in the open. Let's talk about our rationalizations and see if we can start to think, a little bit more thematically about what was in these old texts that's maybe got left by the wayside, and whether there are some echoes of that in what we're dealing with here and now. And that therefore, just the practice of sequences of postures in a group for 60 to 90 minutes could still be infused with something else. And in the hands of a skilled teacher, it is. But it's often the case that that's not sort of articulated, or even in some cases that the teacher themselves might not be able to articulate it if asked. It's a sort of learned embodied transmission, which is lovely, but it will be very helpful if we're all a bit better equipped to think about what's really working and why.
Yeah, the question of bringing yoga philosophy or even yoga into yoga, if yoga is
Mm.
a state of being, not that we can give people that, but we can try and create the container, if you will, the space which will allow people to explore or be introduced to ideas, but not just intellectually in an embodied way, is there's no one way to do that. And typically we're taught to perhaps female classes with yoga philosophy. And sometimes I've struggled with that, um, in the sense that, well, I wanted to ask you, what is the style of yoga that you have found most conducive to seeking yoga in your own life?
Well, honestly speaking, it's retreat. It's spending an extended period absorbed in practice and even conversations about practice. In fact, primarily having that as part of the mix, because otherwise there isn't a sense of what's going on. But that doesn't have to be, a big open free for all dialogue. It's just, with some, let's say, intellectual, kind of structure to it. And that's not to say we get lost in abstract analysis. It's more that there's some explanation of what's happening and why, some suggestions for how to embody that, some sort of reflections on what's been explored so far and how that's going, opportunity to ask questions about that. So to interrogate it, to honestly speaking, inquire. I think the consistent message of all of these yoga teachings is that we don't see properly. We get confused about who we are, and therefore we need to engage in an inquiry to find our true nature. But we also therefore need to inquire into all of the obstacles that are getting in the way. And we also need to inquire into what it is about practices that's helping us and what it is about them that's perhaps in itself compounding the problem. And there are many ways in which I've gone and got very obsessed and done a lot of practice that haven't actually been that helpful. They've just played to my conditioned tendencies and got me a little bit more sunk into those grooves rather than rubbing them into a nice polished smooth surface that I can glide across.
I like that metaphor. Yes, I completely see that in a lot of classes that really push you or that are very fast and dynamic. Well, I guess it's different to different people, but at least for me, those like you're saying can increase those grooves as opposed to quiet them. And it's from my own experience, what I have found works for me more is the slower, the more somatic approach to an asana practice. And inquiry, it's always about inquiry. I think that's curiosity and inquiry. Whereas some people I know the discipline and, for example, an Ashtanga practice, that seems to be what works for them. Although, of course, that ends with meditation as well.
Well, there is obviously, in the history of physical yoga's evolution, the invention, so to speak, or certainly the inclusion of new techniques that will make it easier to sit in an absorbed meditative state. And that's the rationalization often for dynamic physical postural practices. However, so much more time is devoted to these supposed preliminaries than to the actual fruit that I tend to question that and think it's often more of a back rationalization for the enjoyment of asana practice. It's fine to enjoy making shapes with the body, but I think coming back to that theme of grooves and polishing them off a little bit. The challenge for the 6 days a week Ashtangi is to give up their practice for 6 months and do something else, just sit still in the morning instead. And that for most people is so triggering that they won't do it. And in some ways, I suppose quite rightly, they say, I like this. It helps me. It makes me a better person. Why should I stop doing it? But the problem is obviously the attachment to the practice and the attachment to the movement of the body in certain ways that develops. It's another form of conditioned experience that, although it has benefits, has drawbacks. And so it's interesting to look at that. I mean, honestly speaking, the transformative thing in yoga is meditation, and the form that meditation takes varies. In fact, going all the way back to the Mahabharata a couple of thousand years ago, there are these exchanges discussing yoga in great depth, and there's a thesis that pops up a couple of times that yoga is basically meditation, and you can meditate in one of two ways. One of them is to basically hold your breath, because that will thin your mind after a while of holding your breath for as long as you can. You don't have so much going on up there. And the other is to learn to concentrate. So based on that, I mean, you could say pranayama is a sort of prelude to being able to do whatever practice counts as meditation. But you can turn it the other way around as well, as skilled teachers of postural yoga do, and think, well, what is it that's actually active in meditation? First of all, it's concentration training, the ability to absorb the mind in an objective focus. And that's the rationalization for the Ashtanga method, in a way, is to pay close attention to the sequencing of movement with breathing, the gaze at a fixed point, and the application of bandhas in the postures, and all of that is sort of the foundational, yeah, I guess, basis for it being a yoga practice rather than a calisthenics class. Um, so that there is the possibility within these systems to bring meditation in as part of what's happening, but it's still only a meditative quality rather than the absolute absorption of in clear seeing, because movement in the end, um, you know, isn't all that conducive to stability. And the texts are repeatedly, in their early explanations of what yoga was about, talking about steadiness. And while the mind can be sort of steady while it glides through all of these movement practices, it's a different quality of steadiness to that which develops after weeks of sitting for hours at a time. Sometimes that's not what happens, though. You can go on an extended meditation retreat and see just how troubled the mind is, and how agitated and how easily disturbed. And that's what there is to work with. So I don't wish to imply that movement-based asana practice is wrong or not yoga. It's just that there is something else that's being described that isn't actually easy to attain through that. And perhaps doing that as well makes it more possible to see how some of that comes in to the dynamic movement-based posture practice. Whereas just assuming it's there because you're paying attention to breath and movement synchronization, etc., is, I think, only stage one of the process. And there's a lot of assuming it's there that goes on in the yoga practice world. And again, that's why I think it's helpful to talk about these things. It's not to say, certainly, that I've got the answer, I haven't at all, but that we, as practitioners, benefit, if yoga is an inquiry, from asking good questions. And from not just taking our reflexive, self-rationalizing answer as the sort of good enough solution that will paper over the cracks and remove the need for further questions, but being open to actually challenging ourselves a bit more and thinking, well, maybe there is something else here. Maybe I could benefit from trying the opposite to what I'm instinctively drawn towards, and seeing actually that there's a complementarity perhaps to different approaches, which brings me, I guess, back to my dualistic fetish. That yes, if there is an ultimate integration, it is of a polarity of opposites, and that it's helpful to explore in both directions before reaching some kind of synthesis. And that in fact the balance is a very provisional thing in any case, because it's a moving target. It won't be the same today and tomorrow even. And so it does need to be something that we're playing with a little bit. And again, talking about ideas makes that a lot more open and less stressful and more familiar. So to come back to your original question, what I've found most transformative in yoga practice is to be supported in that by a teacher. And it's not something that happens so easily in a drop-in class format, which is why the sort of extended retreat makes that a bit more available. But if you've got a good group, particularly if you can persuade them to sign up even just for a small block of classes, even as few as 4, you've at least got a journey that you're all embarking on together, and creates a kind of container for exploration and inquiry that isn't otherwise necessarily there.
Yeah, it's something I increasingly see philosophy not just as texts, but as you say, containers, institutions, structures which allow inquiry. Because if we look across time and space, yoga is never taught as a kind of isolated pursuit. Even I think it's Daniela at OCHS, she talks on this.
Daniela Bevilacqua,
Um,
scholar of
yeah.
ascetics. Yeah.
Yes, that ascetics, we often have this idea of the renouncer in India, the ascetic, as a very solo individual, very isolated, seeking liberation. But she argues, no, they are deeply enmeshed in sociality within renouncer culture. They have teachers, they have events, big festivals they go to. And so this idea of the isolated yogi is misinformed and maps so well onto modern individualism and the desire to succeed, achieve, actually be deeply attached to that ego and what we might call the small self. And that's why I think, as you say, actually containers within modern yoga, which drop-in classes, especially in places like London or busy cities, don't really provide from my experience. But having more of a container, a group for whether it's learning more about history and philosophy of yoga, which you cannot really at all dive into in a 60-minute class.
But you
Um,
can drop it, kind of sub-clause into a statement, even just the
mm,
acknowledgement that we're doing lots of things here that are relatively recent, but that this one is a very old thing. Even just to sort of spice it up a little bit with some of those references is, and that's okay. And even what you're saying earlier about the point being to meditate at the end, and perhaps even if all
mm,
that's done is to lie down for 5 minutes in shavasana and to sit for a couple of minutes afterwards and see how it all settles in the body, to say, well, what we're tasting here is what people used to do all the time. Because we've got busy lives, it's maybe less easy for us to do this. So it helps to have done some of that first. But this is yoga, what we're talking about here. So that might be, a way in which you can just, with a few words, sow a
mm.
few seeds of curiosity at least, and that might lead to students coming up afterwards and say, "Where can I read more about this other thing that isn't what we do in normal weekly classes?"
And then you can say, my book.
Well, I mean, yeah, that's kind of, I suppose, why I wrote that. Yeah, The Truth of Yoga, very ambitious title, but the working title for that book was Yoga Without the Bullshit. And I was persuaded that that was a bit too triggering, although ironically, very shortly afterwards, there were all these books being published with swear words in the title. Um, yeah, and I wasn't really that I wanted to be that confrontational, to be honest. The book is quite serious in some ways. It was an attempt on my part to try and say, well, let's strip out all the things that have crept into the yoga world that people think of as to do with yoga that really have nothing to do with it, crystal healing or whatever else it might be. That has its own story, but it's not to be found in ancient Indian yoga texts. My interest was in showing what is to be found there, and also in showing how, over time, those texts say different things. So there isn't even, one Indian traditional yoga. There are many different things that yoga has been, and it really depends on context. And so we see this sort of broad shift over time, but it's not even about, trying to have a definitive timeline. It's just about understanding that things are in flux and that different themes come into play in different ways depending on priorities. And as we sort of can surf our way through all of that, the book's got like 100 different small chapters that cover basic themes that come and go in yoga history and philosophy, and start to say, well, these are building blocks out of which worldviews have been built. Perhaps we can reach for one or two of those next time we're trying to think about a worldview to explore. And so when you were mentioning earlier this sort of challenge of theming a yoga class in relation to philosophy, I mean, that's a big challenge, especially when it's a postural yoga class. But what can be there is to take, say, one of the ideas that frames one of those chapters, which are only about 500 words long. Let's say it is the principle of yoga ethics, and to spend a whole year dropping a few words about ethics into class, and to perhaps have a few words to say about various sub themes of this question of ethics, like how hardcore to be, whether the ideas that Patanjali shares are useful enough to be the definitive list of qualities we should seek to embody, or even to just pick one of them and explore it in a dozen different ways each month for the course of a year, and to get really sort of fine grained about something very, very specific and
Mm.
ostensibly very simple that can actually be very complicated indeed, and to just set a few reflections on these topics for people to take away and bring back and discuss, perhaps even as well. So in that
I-
sense, we will be building our own worldview, but we can do it in relation to core themes, and that's why I put the book together that way.
Building our own worldview, but doing it in relation to core and enduring
Mm,
themes. And I think that that piece there about discussion is really important. Like not just the teacher talking, but even if it's not possible during a 60-minute class, creating spaces even after class where there can be dialogue, um, a kind of alternative to that like teacher authoritarian model. And that's where we all learn, because as teachers, we're not perfected beings, but we learn too. And for all of us, I think we learn best through dialogue and inquiry.
100%. I mean, what I do these days is largely to teach, so to speak, by facilitating conversations.
Mm.
And the longer the sort of container, as you were putting it earlier, the more fruitful those conversations become, because the same people are coming again and again to explore ideas together. And yet at the same time, the ingredients for the conversation are subtly changing as we explore a different theme or a different phase of history. And there becomes a more kind of organic process of exchange that emerges in that context,
Mm.
whereby I don't even need to really ask questions so much as just sort of say, "Okay, we're here. Let's start. Who wants to talk?" Um,
Mm.
and there is a lot that people want to say, and they feel
Mm.
more able to say it, more confident in expressing themselves, and more trusting that others are going to listen as well, because we've been engaging in extended dialogues in little groups as well as in a big group, and it's not really about just sit back and listen to me. In fact, it gets very boring sitting back and listening to me. So it's quite helpful to listen to each other, and more importantly, listen to ourselves, and to have a framework for drawing out of ourselves what's otherwise just going on between our ears and not necessarily getting fully formed. Whereas when we're encouraged to express it, we can sometimes really step into an understanding of what's going on for us in a new way.
And you've really hit the nail on the head, at least for one of my key values and understandings of philosophy, which is it's fundamentally a practice of inquiry, which helps us live more meaningful lives. And if we're yoga practitioners, yoga teachers, that practice and profession is a big part of our work, and obviously speaks to this deep spiritual lineage, which may in the past be quite different contextually, as we've discussed, in terms of these high and lofty goals of liberation and renunciation. But nonetheless, the desire to live a good life, whatever that means, a better life, and to find meaning and to inquire and to ask questions about reality and about ourselves is still there.
Mm. No,
Mm.
exactly, exactly. And all of this can be very relaxed. There's a movement that was started, I think, by some guys in Liverpool called Philosophy in Pubs, if I remember correctly. And I think yoga needs something similar, that's just maybe doesn't even use the word philosophy. It's just I ran for a while in London at a big studio chain called Try Yoga, what I called book clubs. And so we would look at a yoga text and talk about it. That was the sort of entry level way in which I was trying to make philosophy part of the weekly curriculum. But it's still a niche proposition. You get a lot more people for a handstand workshop than you do for my yoga book club in the meditation cupboard. But still, it's I think an attempt to try and find a new term for this that isn't philosophy. I think philosophy puts a lot of people off. A lot of people
Mm.
also just enjoy doing things with their bodies and don't want to talk about it too much, and that's
Mm.
okay. But perhaps there's a way of framing it that's just a bit more like, chat, chai and chat type thing
Mm.
of, let's get together and just have a few words about what's going on for us in relation to what we were doing today.
Mm.
And that's the level at which it's meaningful. Otherwise,
And
it's all
and
about.
and that can be still be philosophy, would you say?
I think so. I think otherwise, what we end up doing is,
Mm.
basically trying to be parrots. So we go and find all these old sources to try and feel a bit more secure and authentic, and then we get good at knowing what they say and spout them at each other as if to show that that's made us masters of this stuff. But that's all
Mm.
irrelevant, really. It's when, as you say, it's a way of life that it makes sense, and it doesn't have to
Hence the name of
be.
the podcast.
Well, yes, it doesn't have to be steeped in all of that book learning. I mean, you talk about Daniela Bevilacqua and her research with, living lineages of Indian ascetics. Those guys don't read texts.
Mhm.
Most of them are very disparaging about the idea, but they're interested in, embodying core principles, and they do talk and have, kind of discussions, let's say, or discourses where somebody might, to a certain extent, hold court in order to make clear what it is that's going on. And the guru is certainly discussing that with students. So
Mhm.
I think that is philosophy. It's just talking about what's alive for us in relation to the practice, and trying to make sure that we're on the right path.
And it comes back to that idea that philosophy, this idea that I'm constantly thinking about, that philosophy is not just ideas, and definitely not just abstract ideas, and definitely not abstract ideas that are complete and universal and perfect and right and objective. But philosophy is actually about that inquiry, that conversation. And most importantly, we need the spaces to do that, whether that's ourselves in dialogue with a text, creating that space in meditation or in community. And I think that's such a great thing to be able to do, whether on a course or in a yoga studio, being able to come together, um, explore.
I wholeheartedly agree. Yeah. And that is in some ways the true yoga, the quest, the inquiry, the sort of ongoing. I mean, I hesitate to use the word search because that's, again, got a bad name. The more you seek, the harder it is to find. But I think we have to be motivated in some way, in a particular direction. We need to therefore ask ourselves what that is. What is it that's my intention here? Why am I even coming to class?
Mm.
Um, the clearer we can be about that, the sort of more engaged in whatever it is that yoga means to us we can be. Because otherwise, it's very easy to just sort of assume it's all happening and not necessarily have any kind of uh, method or yardstick for trying to, make sure that it does. Nobody would train to be a sports person in any way without that sort of, framework. You'd have a coach. You'd have, all sorts of training methodologies. You'd have nutrition. You'd have, all sorts of wisdom that you've gleaned from others who've done it before you. And there'd be people constantly pushing the boundaries of how all of that works. Yoga needs that too, but not just in terms of physical techniques. How to get better at bending or whatever it might be, or how to do it more skillfully so you don't get injured, which is probably more useful. But actually, in terms of, how to make more progress with the struggle of being a person. I mean, in the end, that's what it's all about. And I just think, we can't have enough conversations about that.
There's so many more possible topics for philosophical conversation, for reflection about the struggles of our life that aren't necessarily addressed, at least directly in texts. And these are the concerns, priorities of the householder, whether, especially if you're a woman, motherhood, family, for all of us, profession, career, and taking ancient texts at face value and thinking that that's what yoga is, without that inquiry and that interaction between ourselves and the text, between that ancient context, which is different to our modern context, then that won't be as enriching. But those are the real topics that are relevant to us.
100%. And I think the pitfalls, if we start trying to, get all our guidance from ancient texts, is, twofold, really. One is we'll end up, swallowing the yoga fundamentalist worldview and thinking, well, basically, therefore, I shouldn't X, Y, and Z, have a family, have a job, have any possessions, earn any money. And the other is to throw all that out the window while at the same time pretending to, in some way follow it, which is what most people do end up doing, and then go about doing whatever it is I feel like doing and trying to find some way of rationalizing that through the prism of Patanjali. And neither of those is very helpful. It's much more helpful to say, here I am, a confused person, unsure what the right thing to do is. And bingo, that's that's Arjuna at the start of the Bhagavad Gita. Here I am, a confused person, unsure what the right thing to do is. Then we're engaging in philosophy. We've got an inquiry, and we need a wise guide, and we need a framework. And not to say we're necessarily going to get it from the Gita, but we've got then a question, and it might be around any of those topics you brought up. Could be anything. I go to a festival in Norway most summers now, where I'm fortunate enough to be invited to hold conversations about anything. From one of the most difficult topics they gave me was the meaning of life. This time was one about just how do we better accept ourselves. And that's a very relevant and kind of everyday question that makes sense to most of us. And we made some interesting strides with that by having honest conversations about it.
And I'm curious, is that a framework like that you approach that through, or is it just questions and inquiry?
Honestly speaking, it's me trusting the process. I don't know at the beginning of that what I'm going to do. I don't go into a session like that with, a curriculum, so to speak. What I
Mhm.
try to do is to have a few pertinent quotations from ancient sources, which usually enable me to say they haven't got the answer we're looking for, but they've
Mhm.
got some principles that we might bear in mind. And then to invite people in groups to talk to each other about what's alive for them in response to that. And then to try and, through what comes up, weave together something that keeps alive some of those principles while responding to what's happening right there and then.
Well, thank you so much, Daniel. This has been such an interesting and thought-provoking conversation. Um, Now, where can people find out more about you? And I believe you might have a course coming up soon, which would be great to hear more about.
Oh, thank you, Floss. Yeah, it's been a real pleasure. And I really appreciate the questions you've asked and also the context that you've brought to them from, your own experience. And that's really all we're talking about, to have questions and to trust our own experience enough to be able to bring it forward and to not try and imagine that we've got to somehow turn ourselves into the perfect embodiment of whatever we might imagine we need to be. So, yes, people can find out more about me at truthofyoga.com, which is the site where I offer online courses on all the major yoga texts. But I've also got a year-long course for those who really want to dive deep into inquiry, which consists of 20 modules looking at every phase of yoga's evolution, bringing a lot of material out of the scholarly world in an attempt to make that user friendly for teachers and practitioners, and meeting every 2 weeks for a structured discussion of the sort I've just been describing, where we maybe don't ask so much about what's happening in our everyday lives, but more how do we relate to the principles in these teachings from this phase of history, and what might we do with the intellectual tussling both with the material and with the scholarly attempt to make sense of the material, because often that's in itself sometimes quite perplexing. Whereas what we're trying to do is find guidance. And so in the end, we need to, as I say, trust our own intuition and to see what makes sense to us and to have our own way of talking about that. So the course is called The Path of Knowledge. And in a way, that is my view of the meaning of yoga as inquiry, to seek knowledge, and to have a structured program for exploring it. But I have to, I guess, admit that we're not necessarily going to be offering the ultimate knowledge of the truth about the self, to the point that I can give you your enlightened certificate at the end of it. But yeah, because I'm certainly not. But at the same time, hopefully, it will be a way that participants gain confidence in thinking and speaking about ideas. And the end of it is a project which can take any form that anybody likes, to integrate that in some way that makes sense, whether that's a piece of writing, a piece of artwork, an idea for a class that might be taught, or a theme for a bunch of podcast episodes. It can take any form, but that's sort of what's on offer there. And one other thing I will just mention, which is the credit of the place that's hosting it, which is a yoga studio in London called the Shala. They're offering an online yoga philosophy club. So roughly every month or so, I'll be hosting the sort of discussion I was describing having at that festival in Norway, which does very much look at worldly themes. We're going to talk about relationships. We're going to talk about death. We're going to talk about ethical values. We're going to talk about politics. We're going to talk about all the things that are not so easy to talk about through the prism of yoga philosophy. So if you go to their website, theshalalondon.com, you can find out more about that.
Amazing. It sounds like you're providing many containers to explore and inquire, just like we've been discussing today, that are so needed. Earlier, you mentioned the importance of having a teacher.
Yes, I mean, it doesn't even necessarily have to be a teacher at this moment in my life. I don't have, a regular teacher who I'm seeing all the time. I've got various elders who are sort of people I can consult. So I often think of it as a phrase that gets used in Buddhist circles, the spiritual friend, somebody who's a wise guide who is a peer, but at the same time, has a certain standing, a certain degree of, I guess, facility with the whole practice and the process and the path, and is somebody you can turn to ask those awkward questions that we don't have answers for
Mm.
ourselves.
Well, thank you so much for your time, Daniel. It's been really, really interesting and great talking to you. And I hope to talk to you again in the future.
Likewise, Floss, it's been a pleasure. Wish you all the best with everything, and thank you again for inviting me.
I think you'll agree that that was an absolutely fantastic first episode for Series 2 of the Embodying Philosophy as a Way of Life podcast. And I'm incredibly grateful for Daniel for sharing his time, wisdom, and perspectives on these topics. We really covered so much in this episode, from how to bring yoga philosophy into classes to what it means to be enlightened, and how we can, with consideration, explore ancient wisdom and texts in modern times. I know this one I will be returning to again and again and encouraging my students to do the same. If you want to learn more about Daniel and his work, you can find his website link in the show notes below. For now, I want to remind you that this podcast is about philosophy as a practice and a way of life. So I want this conversation to extend beyond just me and Daniel. This inquiry is for you too. Whether you are a yoga teacher, practitioner, or curious listener of another kind, I want to hear from you. Your thoughts, comments, reflections, revelations, and anything else you might want to share. Let's keep the conversation going. You can find me on Instagram at Philosophy and Yoga or on my website, www.philosophyandyoga.com. I'll pop the links in the show notes for you as well. I look forward to hearing from you and can't wait to share the next episode of the Embodying Philosophy as a Way of Life podcast. Until then, have a great day. Bye-bye.